So in this lecture I wanted to talk about financial bubbles and crashes throughout history. Now there's some obvious resonance here in terms of some of the things that have happened in the past to Bitcoin prices and indeed to the prices of other cryptocurrencies even before Bitcoin. Bubbles and speculation are obviously important here, and within that there's really two key strands to look out for. Firstly, the role played by new technology, and this is obviously the case with things like Bitcoin because this is underpinned by the new blockchain technology, and also the element of new investors flooding into a market. And you can sort of think, if you will, of certain stories about new cryptocurrency millionaires. The other thing I wanted to emphasize here though is the history bit. Okay, as always throughout this, even though this is sort of economics and finance, this historical perspective is going to be extremely important. Okay, so even if you're dealing with things that have got a technical content and indeed a strong numerical content, the historical perspective is going to be very, very important here and teach you some valuable lessons. Okay, so bubbles and crashes have happened throughout history, and it just so happens that elements of Bitcoin and blockchain are their most recent manifestation. Okay, so in terms of the layout of this lecture then, I think it's important to try and see where everything's coming from. So I'll try and give a bit of motivation, personal motivation as much as anything else. Then I'll talk about financial bubbles and crashes. And again, there's two or three key ingredients here that you really need to look out for. The first thing is the role played by new technology. Here, blockchain, new investors, non-traditional investors especially, and a certain collective sense of over-optimism and overconfidence. Then I'll talk a little bit about financial history, and again just wanted to emphasize that a historical perspective is always important here, even though we're dealing with cutting-edge finance technology. And indeed, I think you could reasonably argue that a historical perspective is likely to be the only one that doesn't date almost immediately. We'll say a little bit more about that later in the lecture. Some conclusions, and then some references at the end. And unusually for something I teach, because of the nature of the subject, it's probably worth my while going through these references a bit more than ordinarily would be the case. Okay, so hopefully logically constructed. I just want to emphasize here the historical perspective and things like new technology, new investors and overconfidence. So in terms of an overview then, and as promised, bubbles and crashes are inevitable whenever you have either new technologies or an influx of new investors. And there's this modern classic paper here by Zera in 1999 which tells a very nice story around this, and you've clearly got both elements of this with material in this lecture. So new technologies, obviously blockchain, and influx of new investors. Natural to expect this to be brought about if you've got a new development essentially grounded in new technology like blockchain. So these bubble effects and a certain degree of overconfidence may actually be a prerequisite for the successful diffusion of new technologies throughout society, needed to foster innovation and progress and part of the entrepreneurial process. So although it's easy to be wary whenever bubbles are in existence, the fact that they exist isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of themselves, and it's important to be aware of that and that these things are multifaceted. Okay, so you've got these three classic ingredients here. So new technologies, new investors, and a certain degree of overconfidence. Okay, and it's clear that these elements apply, as they have done throughout history, to Bitcoin and blockchain. So in terms of the financial interestingness of Bitcoin then, so as a mathematician I originally got interested in the area as a novel application of mathematical models for speculative bubbles. I had two papers here published over 5 years ago now. So as part of this, Bitcoin contains classical elements of bubbles as we discussed. So new technologies, new investors and excessive optimism. but there are also certain things that are a bit different. Okay, and this is in part what makes the thing more interesting. So Bitcoin contains further things you have to take special consideration of. So things like there's a lack of a central authority like the Bank of England says that bubble effects are likely to remain undiluted. So if you look at the stock index, say the FTSE 100, there's a monetary authority to second guess, so it's unlikely that any bubble effects in the FTSE 100 will continue ad infinitum. That sort of natural break doesn't exist with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. You could certainly argue that concerns of their precise definition and their potential separation between money and the state means that cryptocurrencies are inherently speculative, and historically again you can observe dramatic, almost total boom bust episodes in cryptocurrencies historically. So the aim of this lecture then is that I wanted to discuss Bitcoin within the context of people's personal experience and indeed the historical experience. So the point I wanted to try and make here was that even if you're looking at numerical data or something that's necessarily very technical, there will usually be a sort of compelling human financial story behind all this. As part of that, economics and finance are not a natural science, though there can be a thin dividing line between quantitative social sciences and natural sciences. Indeed, I would argue that I've made the transition across from natural sciences to quantitative social science. The key thing here is not to get too uppity about being a genuine scientist. Okay, the implication I would say here is that as a social science you need as broad a perspective as possible, and within that, however much you like math, historical perspectives are perhaps the only ones that will remain relevant and will not date immediately. Okay, so if you're looking at something that's very technical and is potentially very quantitative, I think the thing to still keep in mind here is that there is potentially a compelling human story that underpins all the data and all the issues under consideration. So the history and the backstory is important. So one thing that is very clear to me is that I think that historical perspectives are perhaps the only ones that will remain relevant and not date almost immediately. And I think it's easy to be caught by surprise just how quickly the subject can move. It's a little bit like the tide at the seaside if you're not paying attention. So in terms of personal anecdote, I published a prize-winning paper on Bitcoin and Ripple in 2016, and this is all very good, and we were looking at the top 2 cryptocurrencies by market capitalization. Within a week of the paper being accepted, Ethereum had overtaken Ripple as the second highest capitalized cryptocurrency. So again, I was very fortunate to have a degree of academic success here, but I was still potentially almost caught out by just how quickly the subject can move. The title of this classical work by Reinhardt and Rogoff summarizes things nicely. So the title of this classic text is "This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly." So probably what's going on is, yes, this is different, but not as different as you might imagine. And so many of these lessons that history tells us with respect to economics and finance continue to be relevant and important today. So it's worth remembering the title of this book then by Reinhardt and Rogoff, which claims that this time is different. So possibly it is different, but not as different as you might imagine. Within this, historical perspectives are the only ones that won't date almost immediately. If you've got things that are, in contrast, tied more closely to specifics of technology and the specific cryptocurrencies that are most in vogue at that time, in contrast, these things can change very, very quickly. So as an apocryphal example then, if you think about the importance of financial information processing throughout history, there's always been this long-standing need for speed facilitated by new technology. Now, whilst that's true, dependent on the historical context, new technology may variously mean carrier pigeon, telegraph, or contemporary algorithmic trading. So potentially very, very different depending on your era. Okay, so the basic idea is that if you study in detail and just focus on exactly what you mean by speed facilitated by new technology, obviously perspective can date ludicrously over a relatively short space of time. However, the core underlying principle, i.e. that speed is important, remains true throughout. Okay, so this is really the main thing. Focus on core underlying principles rather than too much of the specifics of the relevant technology. So in sum then, probably the most likely scenario is this time is possibly a bit different. So yes, it is different, but not as different as you might imagine. You can still learn important lessons from financial history. So as an illustration of this, Bitcoin's commonalities with historical financial bubbles include things like fundamental new technology, the blockchain technology that underpins everything, an influx of new investors, stoked again by development of new technology bringing out non-traditional investors, and this collective sense of excessive optimism and overconfidence. Now, the factors that are in this case possibly a bit different, which does make Bitcoin interesting, is that there's a lack of a central governance structure to dilute bubble effects, and indeed this was a big part of how I got interested in Bitcoin in the first place. I'm not sure this is the best way to express this, but I think there is some speculation inevitable given uncertainties in the economic environment and definition of things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and this potential separation from nation states, and the fact that at least initially the innovation isn't driven by nation states or big companies. So in terms of an overview of financial bubbles and crashes then, so you need as broad a perspective as possible to properly understand financial bubbles and crashes. So I'm a mathematician, but I think within this it's important not to get too obsessed with a scientific training. Simple history may ultimately be able to tell you more. So within this, bubbles and crashes are variously bigger than any individual, bigger than any individual discipline, and also probably inevitable in some form or other due to evolutionary stable human preferences for risk, return and greed, etc. Now, one thing that I haven't stated there is that bubbles and crashes aren't necessarily a bad thing in and of themselves, and that they may play an important role in terms of fostering innovation and entrepreneurial spirit, with this potential for huge reward at what remains a risky time. Also, just bear in mind that there is a human story going on behind whatever numbers or technical data you have access to. So bubbles and crashes are social phenomena and do affect individual people. So as an example of this, if you look to the last decade, you might see, for instance, at the turn of the millennium, a proliferation of TV property shows during the housing market bubble. So bubbles and crashes do represent an interdisciplinary problem, which means that outside of this lecture course they do remain extremely interesting. So conventional economics and finance are obviously important, but cannot tell you the whole story, precisely because bubbles and crashes are an interdisciplinary problem and bigger than any individual discipline. So useful insights can be variously found from psychology, history, which I'm a big fan of, see part 3 of this lecture, and also physics and mathematics, where I began my academic study. And as part of this, in this lecture I will refer to some mathematical and quantitative papers, but the thing I wanted to emphasize here is the story that they tell. And as with all aspects of economics and finance, there's certain occasions where really the only way to get your story told is to use mathematics and numbers. Okay, but within this, I think it's important to emphasize just one final time that whatever numbers and technical data you're looking at, there's always a human story going on behind all this data that you have access to.